Hi folks, Harry Frank from Red Giant here. In this tutorial, I'm really excited to show you a new plugin called Luster from Red Giant Universe. Luster essentially renders a very cool looking bevel glass highlight effect, specifically designed for text. You can create a wide variety of styles that can be used in a number of different ways. Your text can be generated entirely in After Effects, or you can use text from Illustrator, Photoshop, or any other host app that supports text on an alpha channel. So let me dive into a new comp and show you exactly how to use this. So I mentioned we need to start with text that uses an alpha channel because it is going to search for those edges to render a sort of glassy distortion along the edges, and it's also going to render a nice reflection highlight along the surface that bends to the contours of the text. So if you don't have an alpha channel or transparency in there, the effect will not look very good. So let me go into my effects and presets and apply Universe Luster. And by default, you'll see a nice blue gradient effect with a nice highlight running across the front. Now, like many Universe plugins, we've got a very handy preset browser in here that can do a wide variety of presets that you can load and adjust and tweak on your own. Now, let's run through the process of how Luster creates this effect. The first thing that it does is render a gradient across the surface, so at least that's by default. You can also have it render a simple solid color, and this solid color or gradient color will follow the source color section here. The gradient uses a 3-color map. In fact, let me reset this. 3-color map there, or if it's using a solid color, it simply uses the first color, or if you set this to original, it will follow the original color of the source. Now, in addition to that gradient, we can mix in one more layer using the reflection map section. So if I go into the reflection map and use an external layer, in this case, I'm using a fire clip from the good folks over at Rampant Design. So let me go to the reflection source and set that reflection source to Rampant Fire. And what it's going to do is mix in that fire clip with the gradient before it runs through all the reflections and highlights and stuff like that. Now, it's not really popping right now because we probably need to park ourselves at a moment where we really see some cool looking fire. And it also probably needs to be adjusted in terms of its position on the text. So let me go to the center here and adjust the overall center of it. It's also pulling in a reflection blur. So if I turn that down, and I'll also pull up the reflection mix so we can really see that fire popping through. Now, right now, with the reflection mix set to 100, it's essentially replacing the gradient. If I'd like to have this mix a little bit better with the gradient using a different blend mode, I can click on Screen, and this will screen or essentially remove the dark areas from the image while it blends. So now, as I play through this, you can see that the fire is actually mixed with the surface of the bevel. You can see that the fire is actually kind of bending inside the bevel. New to the latest version of After Effects at the time I recorded this tutorial, which is 14.2, is a new source option that allows us to pull in a source using a couple different options. Up until now, in terms of how After Effects has always worked, in the 20 plus years I've used After Effects, anytime it pulls an image from another layer, it always uses the source, the unaffected, untransformed, unmasked source. Now we have the ability to either pull in a masked source or even a source that has effects on it. So this is significant for us because I can add an effect to this fire without having to pre-compose it and stay in the same composition. So let me go to my fire here, go to color correction. I'll add a tint control and set this to a blue color. Now if I go to Luster and set my reflection source to not be the source itself, but the effects and masked version. And you can see that the fire is now being rendered with the tritone effect. Really cool. Moving down the line here, so we've covered what the source is in terms of its gradient, source color, and its reflection map, which those two combined create the source image that is fed into the next couple sections. The next section here is the bevel section. Let me get rid of this reflection map right now, just so we're focusing just on the text. The bevel section is doing two things. The first thing it's doing is rendering a very standard Photoshop bevel style effect on the text. I'm going to turn this glassiness slider down to 0. And you can see that it's a pretty standard Photoshop style effect where it's rendering highlights and shadows that are controlled by an angle, an overall size, and softening control. But on top of that, once it renders that bevel, it also takes a source image, creates a normal map out of it, and feeds it into a 3D glass shader. Now that's what this glassiness is. So if I turn this glass up, you'll start to see a really cool glassiness on the edges of this. In fact, this becomes a lot more obvious if I start to change the color of the bevel. This bevel color is also pushed into that glassiness. That's all pretty straightforward stuff. The refraction X, Y, and Z are one of those things that I was debating whether or not these would be included, but they can do some really cool things, but they can also get some pretty extreme results depending on how you set them. Essentially what this is doing is controlling a light source to that glass shader independent of all the other stuff in here. And originally I tried connecting it to the angle and size and all that, and I found it to be a bit limiting. So just know that these can be pretty sensitive and can greatly affect the look of things, but they are cool to play with. I'm going to set this to a different color here. A bit more easy to explain is the highlight section. This is basically kind of like a reflection card going across the front. Now in a 3D program, you might put like a white card in front of it that is invisible. If you're on a photo shoot, they actually, behind the camera, actually set up like a white flag that is lit up to create this white reflection line. And that's really what it's doing. This is actually putting in a basic white solid in here, and then that white solid is being distorted by two things. It's being distorted by the source image of the contours of the text, and it's also being distorted a little bit by some fractal noise in here. Now, the first option in here is the follow gradient. And now what this is doing, you'll notice I've got a point here at the top and bottom, and I change these. You'll see that it's changing the color. So this is changing the color gradient as it maps from color 1 to color 2 to color 3 in terms of its location. But this is also causing the highlight to follow the gradient position. So you notice that it's following the relative angle between the 2 points as well as its halfway position. So averaging in between those 2 points. If you don't want it to do that, you can uncheck it and manually set the highlight location on your own. But I highly recommend just leaving that set to follow the gradient. Because in addition to that, there's still an additional vertical offset that you can use. And as I push this through, you can see how it's nicely bending to the contours of that image. Intensity is pretty straightforward. It's just how intense it is. And there's an overall rotation that you can push it. And again, this is in addition to those 2 points. So this is actually a relative angle that you can change. If you'd like to offset it a little bit. Fall off control will basically control how far or how deep that card is rendering. I mentioned this is also being affected a little bit by a fractal noise distortion. So if I set this all the way down to 0, we'll basically just see it bending to the contours of the edge, and that edge displace is actually this thing right here. So if you'd like it just to be a flat line, you can turn the edge displace down to 0. If I turn this up, you see it sort of bending to those contours. And then if I turn on the horizon distortion, you'll see that there's an additional fractal noise displacement in there, sort of kind of a mountainy kind of displacement in there. And the overall scale of that is affected by the horizon scale. Now, the color of this, generally you're going to want to leave at white. There's actually a 3-color gradient going on here. You don't see the darkest color because it's set to a screen blend mode. But if I set this something like, well, normal, should see all 3 colors in there, which actually doesn't look that great. I really kind of recommend you just keep it on screen. You can inject another color in here in the mid-tones if you'd like. This can add a nice little color. Let's say we want to put a pink in the reflection there. Drop shadow is pretty straightforward. It's basically just a drop shadow. I just thought the effect looked nice using a drop shadow on there rather than force you to apply one every single time. We just built it in. So that is Luster. It's a very fun plugin to play with. You can create a wide variety of looks with it. I highly encourage you to just spend some time and play with the different parameters in here and create some unique stuff on your own. So that about does it. My name is Harry Frank for Red Giant. Thank you so much for watching.